small flavour of the kind of work that's possible and some of the work that we've done. But I should say that in 15 minutes it's impossible to be comprehensive, so this is really my sort of selected highlights for you, so we'll see how we go. It's really difficult to overstate the importance of mental health problems like depression. These are global public health, these are massive problems globally. And very recently, for example, the World Health Organization announced that depression is now the single leading cause of disability in the world, far outstripping things like that you might think of, like heart disease and cancer and stroke and all of these things. Depression is the #1 cause of disability in the world. So this is a hugely important problem currently, but it's also a problem that's going to get worse in the future, and we need to understand it better, and Biobank is one of the ways that we can do that. Just to recap a little bit on what Kathy has said with a focus on mental health, there's lots of different ways that we can find out about your mental health, both in terms of how you reported things at baseline assessment, but also in terms of the linkage to primary care and health data, hospital admission data, and then of course also in terms of the new thoughts and feelings questionnaire that I think 160,000 people so far have filled out, which has been fantastic. So we know about what medication you're taking, your family history of mental illness. We've got this really important personality scale that I'll show you a bit more about in a second, which is about neuroticism, which is closely related and important for things like depression. And we've got, and also I should say, towards the last 2 years of Biobank recruitment, there was an opportunity to get a little bit extra information in terms of depression and my sort of area of interest, which is bipolar disorder. So there were more specific questions about manic symptoms and depressive symptoms for about 1/3 of the cohort recruited towards the end of recruitment. So all of this has been tremendously helpful, and I hope to show you some of the interesting parts of it. So I've chosen just 3 example areas of work. The first is this crucial area of overlap between mental and physical health. It's been underappreciated in the past, but I think, as I hope to show you this afternoon, this is a massive area, and really the division between mental illness and physical illness, so-called, is very arbitrary and artificial and not real, and this is an important avenue for research. Likewise, the genetic data has been really a sort of step change moment for research into discovering genetic risk factors for things like depressive disorders, and I'm going to show you some very exciting examples of that. And then one area that I'm particularly interested in, which you might not have thought about previously in terms of mental illness, is about our daily rhythms of sleeping and waking and eating, etc., and how important they are for regulating mental health and increasing risk for mental illness as well. So I'm going to show you a little bit of data there as well. But I've got 3 quotes today. The first quote is from Plato. It's a very cultured place, Glasgow, obviously. So the greatest mistake in the treatment of diseases is that there are physicians for the body and physicians for the soul, although the two cannot be separated. So obviously Plato was no slouch. He knew what it was about. Having doctors who only look after your mental health and doctors who only look after your physical health is a very artificial separation. Clearly there's no difference between the mind and the body in many regards, and I'll give you some examples of that. One example, of course, is depression. Depression presents with psychological symptoms like feeling low, anxious, not sleeping, etc. But it's a whole body disorder. So we know that it affects your risk of heart disease. We know that it affects your immune system, that it affects the likelihood of becoming obese, etc., etc. So increasingly we don't think of depression as solely a psychological disorder, but rather a disorder that affects pretty much every part of your body. And that's hugely important. So one of the very early papers that we wrote using the Biobank data was really just a descriptive paper looking at how common for people with depression, people with bipolar disorder, and people who don't appear to have either, how common or how much increased risk is there for things like high blood pressure, diabetes, etc. And the key point here isn't that these things are more common in these groups, but because of the depth of the Biobank data, we were able to control for a lot of other factors like where you live, like your smoking history, like your alcohol history, etc., etc. And that depth of data is really important in trying to tease out the strength of some of these associations. So no big surprise, actually, that people with depression are at greater risk of high blood pressure, of diabetes, heart disease and stroke. And then in my specialist area, these risks are even increased further for people with bipolar disorder. And I think what that tells us is that this is partly about lifestyle, and it's partly about where you live and all of that stuff, but it's also an indication that there's a shared genetic vulnerability that cuts across your susceptibility to getting depressed as well as your susceptibility to getting heart disease. And Biobank is going to be a fantastic tool for teasing that out further. Okay, second quote. Most of the time I don't have much fun, the rest of the time I don't have fun at all. So I was trying to find who's the most neurotic person I can think of. So I went looking for pictures of Woody Allen, and lo and behold, there was a quote from Woody Allen. So this is about neuroticism. This is a heritable personality trait, so it runs in families, and in fact, something like 40% of the risk of being highly neurotic is genetically determined, and that's important for discovering genes for neuroticism. And it's all about how you respond to stress. So some people are very resilient to stress, others tend to react to stress with high anxiety, low mood, so-called negative affect. But the important thing about the personality trait of neuroticism is that it's associated quite strongly with depression as well as with anxiety disorders, but also a range of other mental health problems like PTSD, substance misuse, even schizophrenia. It's also, in general, overall, the broad definition of neuroticism is associated with dying slightly younger, although there are subgroups of neuroticism possibly where you might live a bit longer, but the broader picture is that it's not actually that good for your long-term health. And of course, if you scale that up, a highly neurotic population is not good for the economy and public health, and we need to understand that a bit better. A reminder of the questions that you filled in, just let you go through that and tot up your score again if you're interested. So you can put up your hand if you scored 12. So you might, on the face of it, these questions don't tell us very much, but together they're really, really helpful, and it's obviously tapping into anxiety and that kind of stuff. So one of the really exciting things that I was involved with a couple of years ago now was the opportunity, based on the first release of genetic data, to try and find genetic variants that might increase an individual's risk of neuroticism. So we were able to do this in a very large number of people from Biobank as well as from other cohorts, and for the first time really discovered parts of the genome that were where there were gene variants that were associated with a slightly increased risk of being neurotic. And interestingly, a lot of those areas that we identified contain genes that had previously been associated in smaller studies with the biology of depression. So that was very, very important. That's now since been replicated and extended in about 350,000 people from UK Biobank, with even more areas of the genome identified. So this is an evolving picture, but really, really exciting for mental health. But perhaps even more exciting is the potential to discover genes for depression. So neuroticism is a trait related to depression, but major depressive disorder, discovering genes for depression has been difficult so far because of low sample numbers in the studies. But Biobank has now contributed to a very large global effort from the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium to bring together samples and clinical descriptions to do properly powered studies to discover genetic risk variants for depression, with a lot of very recent success. So this is published as a preprint, but it's still not published generally. But I think it's reasonable to tell you that when this group, the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium, looked at 130,000 cases and 330,000 controls, 44 areas of the genome harboured genes that are associated with increased risk of depression. So that's a bit of a game changer in terms of what we think causes depression. It sort of confirms depression as a legitimate brain disorder. But even more interestingly, the genetic risk for depression overlaps substantially for other non-psychiatric conditions like being obese. So some of the genes for depression are shared with the genes that make people put on weight. some of the genes for depression are associated with the same, overlap with the genes that are associated with lower educational attainment. And of course, there's a genetic overlap with more severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia. So this is really a huge study and a bit of a landmark in depression genetics. And it's partly because of Biobank. Okay, final quote is from polymath and founding father of the United States. Early to bed, early to rise makes man and woman, I presume, healthy, wealthy and wise. So Benjamin Franklin, also no slouch, he knew what it was about. He was tapping into this idea of chronotype that some of you may be aware of. So there's an opportunity for a small study here. So some of us are morning people. I'm a morning person. My wife's an evening person. It causes havoc at home. But evening people tend to prefer doing things in the morning. Night owls tend to do things more productively at night. So who would call themselves a night owl here? What proportion? So about 20%, I would say. And morning people? Oh, that's very interesting. So that's about at least half of the group. And lots of people are in the middle. So maybe we should have had this in the morning, this event. So chronotype's really important for lots of different health outcomes. And most of you will be relieved to hear that early morning people tend to do better overall in terms of their long-term health outcomes. Being an evening person isn't as good for you. So these are self-reported and obviously subjective reports. So when you say you're an evening person, you may or may not be. So what's very important is getting an objective measure of morningness or eveningness, which we can get from the activity monitoring that 100,000 of you did. So there's a way to process the activity data to derive measures of sort of rhythmicity of your rest activity cycles averaged over a week. And it's this rhythmicity which is much more interesting in terms of your health outcomes. As I said, these are crucial for health and well-being, and it's fantastic that Biobank have got this on 100,000 people. It's not just your physical health, it's obviously your mental health as well. Just to give you some examples, circadian disruption, so-called, or sort of dysregulation of your sleep activity, your rest sleep activity has been associated with a very wide range of problems. It's probably important for cancer risk, for obesity, for cognitive impairment, and obviously a big interest for me is with the very strong association with mood disorders like depression and bipolar disorder. So just to give you a flavour of some of what's possible with this, so we were able to construct for all of those 100,000 recordings measures of circadian rhythmicity, such as relative amplitude. And amplitude just refers to how robust the changes in your rest activity cycle is, averaged over a week. And perhaps unsurprisingly, but important because we were able to control for lots of things, is the reality that high amplitude, a nice robust wave of activity is better for your health in general, but having lower amplitude is associated with being more neurotic, lower self-reported happiness, lower health satisfaction, greater loneliness reporting, more smoking, more alcohol, more instability of your mood, increased risk of depression, increased risk of bipolar disorder. So this is going to be really, really helpful for us. And one of the things we've done very recently that I'm not allowed to show you is that we've done a genetic study of relative amplitude, and we found some really interesting results in terms of the overlap with bipolar disorder, for example. So this is going to be lots and lots of work in the future, but also highly, highly relevant to mental health. That's me. I want to recap and say, hopefully I've convinced you that mental and physical health disorders are not separate. They overlap substantially. This is a landmark study for discovering risk factors for depression. And when we know more and more about circadian rhythms, that will be important from a public health perspective. But thank you for your attention.